Thanks for standing by, and thank you so much for getting up early like this. This is
I'm going back to bed soon.
Pardon?
I'll go back to bed soon.
Okay. So I sent you a little note about what we've been doing, and so we've actually run a card sort exercise where a group of 5 people acted as one person and did a card sort, and then we had them all up on the wall over there, and we talked about how we would take that information and apply it somehow, and the different things we think about when we're looking at for commonalities and outliers and stuff like that. And so what we have is, I've got a mic and I've got the computer set up here in front of me. We're going to ask people with questions to come up, step up to the mic, and ask you their questions about card sorting.
Cool. How many people do you have there today?
About 33, 35.
Cool. Great.
And so
nice
yeah, we've
turnout.
been having a lot of fun up to now. So I think this is the perfect way to top it off.
Cool.
So who has a question? Okay, got one right here. Come on up. You can just stand in front of the table and talk to the mic. If you look down that way.
So cool, isn't it?
How are you?
Thank you.
Tell your name and ask your question.
My name is Brian Lim. I'm a UX student over at General Assembly. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on width versus depth for the card sorting.
For the card sorting or for the eventual information architecture?
How about both to make it a 2-part question?
Okay, because for card sorting, it doesn't matter. Like, you're trying to figure out how people think. And some groups will try to categorize and recategorize and actually make hierarchy. And some groups will just be like, yeah, there's a pile of stuff. Those things go with those things. But then you've got to put all of that together, what you learned with the card sort and what you learn with any other research, and also really listening to the language and the way they use terminology, and really understanding your content and your content analysis to then figure out whether you end up with a wide hierarchy or a deep one. And there's no right and wrong with that, especially so even if you ended up with something like a quite deep hierarchy and you're like, oh my God, this is going to be awful. People will need to click through and click through and click through. Well, sites don't end up like that anyway. You can always get people from a start to somewhere else. They fall in by Google. So sometimes the advantage of a deep hierarchy is just how the content naturally works really well. So it's like that is kind of the question that you will ask during your project and will solve during your project, is what shape that is. And then you will also figure out in kind of navigation design how you're going to get people to things easily.
Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there was someone else had a question down there. Yes, come on up. Say your name and ask your question.
Hi.
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 Just step up a tiny bit more. Gotcha.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi. My name is Autumn. My question is, so it makes a lot of sense to me why you would do an open card sort and let your participants name the categories the way that they think about them. What would be the scenarios where you would want them to do it closed and not give them that opportunity?
Basically never.
Okay.
Yeah, like literally never. You are right on the money of going, what the fuck is this for? The only reason it exists in our kind of arsenal of tools is because this technique is kind of old, and I've never even figured out where the technique originated, but it's always been in the literature as an option, but it doesn't actually make sense because the only context I've ever really been able to think where you might want to do something like that is if you're creating like a document management system where people literally are saying, I have content that I need to put into buckets. That is the only user case for putting content into categories. like it isn't what they do. So even if, like, sometimes people will say, well, our top level hierarchy is fixed and chosen already, so we'll do a closed card sort to see where people will put the content. But in that case, you better to do it something like a tree test and say, okay, here's our top level categories. If you needed to do X, where would you look? So yeah, like I've literally never done a closed card sort. It has no space, but exists in the literature, and people often will do it kind of without really thinking what you've just thought of, like, what is the point of this?
Yeah. Cool.
So you're right on the money.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Who's next? Say your name.
Hi, can you see me?
Hello.
All right.
Yep.
This is Madeline, and I wanted to know if you could speak to, during the analysis portion, how do you balance prevalence or like utilitarian rule, the most people put this in a category, with concerns with accessibility for smaller populations whose needs could be overruled by the larger?
Yep. So like the thing that you learn from a lot of people doing a thing is that there's enough kind of cognitive relevance to enough people to make it work eventually. Like for most people, using terminology like that or bundling up content in a particular way will work for them. And then the less frequent responses that you hear will tell you something else. They'll tell you that your audience has a different cultural background and a different way of thinking about the world, or a different way of using terminology, and they're important. And you'll also see whether they kind of have any crossover in concepts, or whether they're really, really different. And like this is, again, you learn these interesting things, and you're like, well, what do we do with those now? Do we kind of go with kind of a mainstream approach and hope that people understand it? Do we do something different with trying to capture the attention of the people who don't have that same terminology? But it is a good question to ask, because you don't want to exclude people. You particularly don't want to marginalize people who are already marginalized because they don't have the same understanding of, you know, of terms. So yeah, it's a it depends question, because again, you'll solve that as you go forward in the project, and again, test it with them once you've come up with it, so you can make sure that you haven't really lost people.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Who else? Who's next?
Hi, my name is Esther, and I have a question about labeling. I work in healthcare. So the people that I work with are physicians and nurses. And so we treat people with diabetes, people who are obese. And where can I go to get better labels than saying we're targeting the diabetes people? Like in our applications, what can I say gently so that my target audience knows I'm talking to them without labeling them?
Yeah. You can really only get that by looking at how people talk about themselves. So that might come from maybe things like forums. Like if there's forums where people talk about their illness, by actually doing research. Excuse me, the cat is going to walk across the keyboard.
And catch up.
That is what most of my meetings look like. The cats are like, what are you doing up at this time, and why didn't you give us breakfast? Yeah, so also like doing research with those people will help you understand how they think about themselves. Nobody thinks like the way that the medical industry or the rest of the community labels them. So they might think, I've done a little bit of work in diabetes. They may be thinking, I don't know how to eat healthily, or I'm having trouble with managing alcohol, or you know, things like that. So listening to them will give you ways of figuring out like how to bridge that medical terminology of, you know, people talking about people who are obese or who are alcoholics or all the things that go into diabetes, and the way that that people talk about themselves, and that will help you then use language. It will be you'll need to do quite a lot of internal work though as well, because in my experience, those industries are very, very wedded to their language and way of thinking about people. So you'll need to also really help them understand that that's not how people think about themselves.
Okay.
You get it out of like the way they talk about themselves.
And the bridge would be for us to access the people that we want to serve, we have to use different terminology. That's my selling point, right?
Yeah. Well, you might not have to. They might understand well enough from having been spoken to for a long time, and it may not be a problem. But you know, it probably is. Like they're probably not thinking about themselves the way the medical profession do.
They're being labeled. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Donna, it's Lori.
Hello.
I have a question. So when you have done your card sort, you've done your project, and now it's time to talk to your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
What are some good strategies that you can employ to help them understand what you did, why you did it, and then help them understand what they should do now?
So the trick to that one is being really clear about what you think they should do now. And I think that's the thing that people go in with not being certain. So like I'm in the middle of writing a book on presenting design work and getting great feedback. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, like how do you, whether it's like presenting your designs or presenting the outcomes of research, how do you get the best out of what you want from people? And that starts from, what do I want from people? What have I learned? What am I hoping that they will change their mindset around? Or what am I hoping that they will validate? So if you go in with a clear idea of what you want out of that and not just going, we did this thing, there you go. If you can be really clear about what you want from them, then you can tell them exactly what you want from them. Like, we did this thing, we are unsure whether it's representative of a large user group. Let us know whether this resonates with you for what you know. Or we did this thing, we are going to need to change the way we do things because of these other things. This is how this will need to work out. Let us know whatever you need to know. So yeah, go in knowing what you need to know, not just, hey, we did some research.
Hi, I'm Sonia.
Hi.
I'm working for a startup. So I will like to know if you would recommend something for unmoderated test and remote. So if you know like some strategies to do that.
Do you want strategies or tools?
Well, both, if possible.
Okay. So tools, still the best tool for unmoderated remote card sorting is Optimal Sort, which is made by Optimal Workshop. It's been around now for, you know, probably 15 years, maybe longer, and is a solid tool. There are a couple of tricks with doing unmoderated remote searches that are different to doing face-to-face physical searches. When you do things face-to-face and physically in person, you can get like quite a good size deck of cards, and you can spread them out, and you kind of spatially know where they are, and you know you put those things over there, and because you're really using your body to remember and categorize. When you're doing that on screen, you don't have that kind of spatial memory, so it's harder for people to manage as many cards. Like I've done card sorts in person with 200 cards because people really can manage their physical environment. You can't do that on screen. It's just like you're in this little space, and you have to remember, and it's all bitsy. So you'll need to reduce the number of your cards. And also people are much less motivated to sit in front of a computer and do that than they are when they're in room with you potentially. The other thing to be really mindful and like literally to test this ahead of time is be really both careful with your instructions and precise with your instructions. Because as you probably just saw today in working through an exercise, people get halfway through and then they're like, oh, hang on, what am I meant to be doing? So you need to be able to really clearly tell them why they're doing a thing and what they're meant to be doing, but also not overwhelming them. So you might give, if it's really crucial, give them an intro video or some way of helping them understand what they're there for. But do expect a drop off in numbers. People will get partway through the activity and just go, nah, can't be bothered, where they would never just walk out of a room. So they are harder, but they're useful when you can't get participants in. Oh, and third trick is also do an in-person card sort so that you can see the difference. So you can see what people came up with physically and what people came up with remotely, because you might get quite different answers, and then you'll need to think about why that happened.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, hi, can you see me?
I can.
Done. So one of the questions I have, when we just did a card sorting exercise where we kind of like had different clothing materials into different sections. So one of the things that like we were getting into was what happens when these categories overlap. So for example, if there were t-shirts, it could go for men, women, and kids. If it's like pajamas, it could go in nightwear or like home leisure or something like that. So how do we like solve this when like things go into like multiple categories?
Sometimes this is a technological constraint or opportunity. So first figure out what you can technically do with that. Because if you have, I'm wearing leggings right now. Leggings can be worn by a bunch of, by both binary genders if you're going to go that way, or possibly by children as well. So leggings, you might, in your technical system, just mark as more than one category, and they just appear in more than one category. A lot of the time we get constrained by the technology that we have. And in that case, you'll need to understand how to work with your technology, possibly to put it in one primary place and make sure that people can still get to it from other places. Okay. But also, like, just be careful about situations where you end up with content that might end up in a bunch of different places in a scheme. That's usually the indicator that there's something wrong with your classification scheme. Okay. So like if you're selling clothing that is, I don't know, relatively gender neutral, you may not want to ever have men, women, children as your primary scheme. You might have active wear, business wear, whatever comes out of your card sort. Don't also be afraid, like this is a situation where you could do a bunch of research and you do this with users and you could still go, actually, everybody did this, but it's still wrong. Because people are going to put things in binary male, female buckets, and that may not be the best thing for the content.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it often will be go back, check your technology and find out what you can do. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we've got about 3 minutes. So one more question.
Hi, my name is Jane.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I tend to do a lot of card sorts online, remote, unmoderated, a lot of people. And so
cool.
I was hoping to get strategies from you on what to do when the data shows that there's kind of a very close percentage between winners, right? There's no clear winner. Usually I go to the dendrograms to give me some sort of context, with more context. And sometimes I use adendogram data versus then the percentages that the tool gives me. And I use user zoom. So is there any other strategy of how to kind of break the tie and get a winner versus using the dendrograms?
No. And the reason is you're not after the right answer. Language, cognition, classification, concepts are not right or wrong. So there can't be a winner and a loser, because that's not what this is about. This is about understanding how people think about concepts and categories and ideas, and how they will be thinking when they're approaching your content to perhaps learn. So the thing you're really after is not winners and losers, but what's the weird stuff in here? Why do people do those odd things? If we go this way, what kind of effect will that have on everybody else? Will they understand it? Is it close enough? So there's no winner because there's no correct answer in categorization. So you're always, and over time, picking like the best way of making both your content and making your content work for the way your people think. And over time, both of those things change. Your content changes, the way people think change. So it's an always moving feast. I think that statistical analysis leads us often along the wrong path of thinking that there's a right way to do this. And sometimes you're better just wallowing around in the messy kind of detail and see what people really do.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Donna.
Hello. Good to see you.
You too. I'm Jen, for those who don't know. We had a question earlier and I wanted to ask you. It was about, you've collected this data from the card sort, you've got some ideas, but your stakeholders have their own terminology that they still want to use, or they don't want to use what the participants has supplied. I know you've never been in this situation, but what are some tips that you could share with the group on how you navigate those kind of hairy situations?
Part of the answer to that is really understanding your stakeholders as well and their perspective, understanding why they want to use that terminology, if it's primarily historical reasons, if it's real accuracy reasons. The time I've seen this happen most is where, like for content sets where people have very low understanding, like users have low understanding and the stakeholders have high understanding. Sorry, I've got these crazy tattoos on my arm. They even distract me. And the stakeholders have really high understanding of the content and the accuracy. And what happens then is people come in with a mindset that is actually inaccurate. And you can't say to specialists, you have to use the wrong terminology for the content and able to communicate with people, because that's actually also not okay. It's not okay to be inaccurate in your content just because users are using potentially old terminology, or that there's just a real gap in understanding. So your job in a project is, how do we bridge that again? How do we help people understand from where they are to where they need to be, so that they can do what they need to do? But yeah, really listening to the stakeholders to find out what's going on there, because their perspective is important. You might have missed some important business goals or some reasons for presenting the content in the first place that matter as well. So we always should put as much research into understanding our stakeholders and understanding their goals and understanding why their perspective exists as much as we do our users as well, because otherwise you will never ever get a project across the line.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right, thanks, Donna.
That one happened a lot.
Donna, thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you.
I'm a little disappointed Nell is here and didn't ask a question, but she's going to hang out in the background. So thank you so much for getting up early in the morning and joining us. We'll let you go back to sleep now. Hopefully you can just have a lazy Sunday with the cats.
Yeah, pretty much. I might move. Thanks.